Andrei Belousov did not enter Russia's defense ministry as a battlefield commander. He entered as an economist. That alone made him an unusual choice. Russia was locked in a long war in Ukraine, military spending was rising fast, and Vladimir Putin suddenly replaced Sergei Shoigu with a man better known for economic planning than military command. Reuters described Belousov as a surprise appointment, a technocrat brought in as Moscow prepared for a prolonged war and tried to get more efficiency from an expanding defense budget. On the surface, the logic made sense. Modern war is not fought only with tanks and generals. It is fought with factories, contracts, logistics, supply chains, and money. Reuters reported that analysts saw Belousov's appointment as a sign that Putin wanted the economy tied even more closely to the war effort. But Belousov was not stepping into a clean system that only needed better management. He was walking into a ministry already under suspicion, already under pressure, and already surrounded by scandal. By the time he arrived, corruption investigations had begun to spread through the Russian defense establishment. Reuters reported that the ministry had been rocked by a major bribery scandal and that Belousov's appointment was widely seen as part of an attempt to clean up the system while making wartime spending more effective. That is what makes Belousov interesting. Not because Reuters tied him personally to bribery. It did not. But because he inherited one of the most politically dangerous positions in Russia at exactly the wrong moment. He was supposed to be the man who imposed order. Instead, from the very beginning, he found himself standing in the middle of a ministry beginning to crack open. Reuters later described the corruption cases as the biggest scandal to hit the Russian army in years. It also reported that Belousov had been tasked with purging corruption and streamlining finances to support the war in Ukraine. That meant his job was larger than defense policy. He was now responsible for the credibility of the ministry itself, and that is a different kind of burden. When a defense minister inherits scandal, every arrest becomes part of his story. Every missing ruble, every suspicious deal, every hidden asset becomes evidence of the system he now represents. Even if the scandal began before him, it becomes his test the moment he takes the chair. Belousov's early public comments reflected that managerial tone. Reuters reported that he emphasized the need to take better care of Russian soldiers and complained about excessive bureaucracy around housing, medicine, and benefits. On the surface, those remarks sounded practical. But underneath them was a deeper truth. Money and systems inside the ministry were not moving cleanly. And in a wartime state, corruption is not just theft. It is distortion. It means money intended for readiness can disappear into private hands. It means bureaucracy becomes a shield. It means a war machine designed to sustain combat begins to serve insiders instead. In a long war, that kind of corruption is not simply embarrassing. It is dangerous. So Belousov entered office under a contradiction. He was meant to be the cleaner, the technocrat, the man who would discipline the system. But the system he inherited was already telling another story. A story of arrests, bribery accusations, and an institution whose internal crisis was beginning to rival the war it was built to fight. By the time Andrei Belousov took over, the struggle inside Russia's defense ministry was no longer only about Ukraine. It was about whether the ministry itself had become compromised. Every major scandal has a point where it stops feeling like rumor and starts feeling real. For Russia's defense ministry, that moment came with Timur Ivanov. Reuters reported that the crackdown began in April 2024, when Ivanov, then a deputy defense minister and a close ally of Sergei Shoigu, was arrested on suspicion of taking bribes. This was not a low-level case. Ivanov sat near the top of the ministry and oversaw financially sensitive areas including property and construction. His arrest sent a message that investigators were willing to move against one of the most senior figures in the defense system. That changed everything. One arrest at that level does not look like ordinary discipline. It looks like breach. It tells the public that corruption is no longer hidden at the margins. It suggests the rot may be much closer to the center than anyone admitted. And then the scandal widened. Reuters reported that Yuri Kuznetsov, the head of personnel at the Defense Ministry, was detained on suspicion of taking a large bribe. Investigators said they found more than $1 million in cash and valuables at his properties. That detail mattered because it turned the story from abstract corruption into something people could picture: hidden money, luxury, wealth piled up inside a wartime bureaucracy. Soon after, Reuters reported more arrests in the widening probe, including Lieutenant General Vadim Shamarin, a deputy head of the General Staff, and a senior procurement official. By then, the pattern was unmistakable. Personnel, command, procurement, different parts of the same machine were all being pulled into the scandal. That is when the narrative changed. It stopped looking like one bad official. It started looking like a system, and that is far more dangerous. A single corrupt official can be removed. A corrupt network raises a much darker question. How much of the ministry was functioning through private gain while the country was fighting a war? For Belousov, the timing was brutal. He had barely taken office when the arrests began to define the ministry around him. Reuters had already framed his appointment as part of a push for wartime efficiency and stronger control over defense spending. But once the scandals exploded, efficiency no longer sounded like a technical goal. It sounded like an emergency. That is the cruel logic of inherited scandal. You do not need to create it to be consumed by it. Once Belousov became defense minister, he also became the face of whatever came next. If the arrests continued, it would suggest the rot ran deeper. If they stopped too quickly, critics could wonder whether the cleanup had limits. Either way, he was trapped inside a story he did not start. And by mid-2024, Reuters was already calling it the biggest scandal to hit the Russian army in years. That phrase matters, because it tells you this was not just another corruption story in an already opaque system. It was large enough, deep enough, and politically serious enough to stand out even in Russia's own elite world. Belousov had entered the ministry as an economist. Within weeks, he looked more like the man standing over a battlefield of arrests. The deeper the cases went, the harder it became to see them as isolated incidents. They began to look like signs of a wartime system that had become profitable for insiders. That distinction matters because corruption inside a defense ministry is not like corruption inside an ordinary bureaucracy. In a war economy, every inflated contract, every diverted fund, and every rigged procurement deal runs through the machinery that keeps soldiers supplied and operations moving. Reuters reporting on Belousov's rise made that clear. Russia was reorganizing around long war economics, and defense spending was becoming more central to the entire state. That meant corruption inside the defense ministry was not just a criminal issue, it was a strategic one. Reuters later reported that former Deputy Defense Minister Pavel Popov was detained on suspicion of fraud in another major case, one linked to construction issues surrounding a military theme park near Moscow. Even that detail was revealing. The scandal was not confined to one supply chain or one corner of procurement. It stretched into construction, prestige projects, and wider defense-related spending. Then the cases against Timur Ivanov expanded. Reuters reported in October 2024 that he faced new embezzlement charges involving more than 3.2 billion rubles, including allegations tied to money transfers and inflated purchases. Ivanov denied the charges, but the expansion of the case deepened the sense that investigators were uncovering something broader than simple bribery. This is what turned the scandal into something larger than a normal anti-corruption story. Bribes are easy to understand. One official, one payoff, one favor. But once allegations involve embezzlement, offshore channels, inflated acquisitions, and repeated links to senior defense figures, the picture changes. It begins to suggest that parts of the war machine were not merely being skimmed. They may have become systems for extracting wealth. And because Russia was fighting a long war in Ukraine, the implications were even darker. A state preparing for a prolonged conflict cannot afford a defense bureaucracy that behaves like a marketplace for insiders. Reuters framed Belousov's role around wartime economics and efficiency. That is exactly why the scandal was so politically dangerous. It threatened not just the moral standing of the ministry, but its functional credibility. Belousov had been chosen because he understood systems: production, budget flows, industrial planning, state coordination. That made him useful to Putin, but it also made the corruption storm around him more revealing. If the old system had grown too loose, too protected, and too lucrative, then Belousov's mission was not minor reform. It was forced reconstruction. That is why this scandal works as a story about a war machine, not just about a ministry. When war money expands, secrecy expands with it. Oversight narrows. Urgency becomes an excuse. Loyal networks harden. And people inside the system learn that wartime pressure can protect them as much as it empowers them. Belousov was not presented by Reuters as the architect of that system. But once he inherited it, he became the man expected to control it. And that is when his political danger truly began. Because from that point on, the question was no longer just who stole what. It was what kind of state Russia had built to wage war, and whether that state had allowed corruption to become part of its operating model. The simplest reading of Belousov is also the cleanest one. Putin looked at a defense bureaucracy drowning in wartime spending and corruption allegations, then sent in an economist to restore order. Reuters supports that reading. It described Belousov as a civilian technocrat with no military experience who was tasked with streamlining finances and purging corruption. But in Russian elite politics, a crackdown is rarely only a crackdown, because anti-corruption campaigns can serve more than one purpose. They can expose real theft. They can discipline institutions. But they can also shift power. Reuters reported that analysts believed the investigations may also reflect struggles aimed at weakening Sergei Shoigu's network after Belousov replaced him. That possibility changes the story. If Belousov was really sent in to clean house, then the scandal proves why he was needed. But if the arrests also help dismantle an old patronage structure, then Belousov becomes something more ambiguous. He is no longer only a reformer. He is also the calm, technocratic face of a political purge. And that ambiguity follows every case. The arrests may be real. The corruption may be real. But the political use of those arrests may also be real. Reuters described the ministry as undergoing a major shakeup. That phrase captures both ideas at once. A shakeup can mean reform. It can also mean controlled redistribution of power. Belousov's own profile made him useful for exactly that kind of moment. He was not a military insider rooted in the same old defense clan structure. He was an economic manager, a planner, a man whose legitimacy came from his usefulness to Putin rather than from personal military prestige. That outsider status gave him room to act where insiders might have been constrained. That is what makes him such a strong character in this scandal. He is not the obvious villain. He is the official standing in the center of a crisis, carrying the language of reform, while the institution around him is convulsing with arrests and accusations. And that creates a deeper tension in the story. If he cleans the system, he proves why he was appointed. If he does not, then the scandal becomes proof that the corruption was too deep to control. And if the cleanup also helps redraw the balance of power inside the Kremlin's wartime state, then reform and political consolidation become impossible to separate. Belousov may prefer the simpler story: efficiency, discipline, less bureaucracy, better support for soldiers, and tighter control over wartime spending. Reuters repeatedly tied him to those themes. But the deeper the scandal ran, the harder it became to tell where anti-corruption ended and power politics began. And once that uncertainty takes hold, the man sent in to restore order becomes part of a darker question. Was Belousov cleaning the ministry, or helping redesign who controlled it? Andrei Belousov may never be remembered as a man personally accused of corruption in the scandal that hit Russia's defense ministry. That is not what Reuters shows. What Reuters shows is that he became defense minister at the exact moment the ministry was exposed to one of the biggest corruption scandals in years, and then inherited responsibility for cleaning it up while Russia continued fighting a long war. That is a brutal inheritance, because once a ministry loses credibility, the minister is judged not only by policy or results, but by whether the institution beneath him can still be trusted. Every new arrest reopens the question. Every new allegation suggests the corruption may have gone deeper than officials first admitted. And the scandal did not vanish after the first headlines. Reuters reported in 2025 that Timur Ivanov's trial had begun, describing it as the first in a series of cases signaling Putin's drive to punish corruption in the armed forces. It later reported that Ivanov was sentenced to 13 years in prison, while more than a dozen people, including other former deputy ministers, had been arrested in separate investigations. That matters because it shows the scandal matured into something more serious than temporary embarrassment. It turned into trials, convictions, and institutional reckoning. Not necessarily a clean one, not necessarily a transparent one, but still a reckoning. And that is what gives Belousov's story its final twist. He was chosen precisely because he did not look like a scandal figure. He looked like the opposite, a sober manager, a systems man, a technocrat meant to impose order on a sprawling wartime bureaucracy. But the cleaner walked into a room already full of smoke. And once he entered, the smoke became part of his image. That is how high office works in a crisis. You inherit not only power, but the unpaid debts of the institution. You inherit its failures, its hidden networks, its tolerated abuses. Even if your own name stays clean, the system can still stain your political identity by proximity. That is why Belousov is such a compelling figure for this story. He is not the man at the center of the bribery allegations. He is the technocrat standing in the blast zone after the explosion. He represents a wartime state trying to discipline one of its most important institutions just after that institution was exposed as vulnerable to corruption, patronage, and elite abuse. That contrast is what gives the story force. Because in the end, Belousov's significance is not that he personally symbolizes corruption. It is that his appointment revealed what Putin thought Russia needed most at that stage of the war. Not another military showman, but a manager capable of controlling a defense bureaucracy that had become too large, too costly, and too scandal-ridden to be left alone. So the cleanest way to understand him is this. He did not create Russia's military corruption scandal. He inherited it. But he inherited it at the worst possible moment. When the war was still grinding on, the money was still flowing, and the arrests had already begun to show that one of the most powerful institutions in the country might also be one of its most compromised. And from that point on, whether he liked it or not, the scandal stopped being only the ministry's. It became his test.